Russia is bleeding, not just at the front lines where its losses continue to rise, but deep inside its own territory. The country has suffered a severe, potentially fatal internal hemorrhage, and even the Russian president, Vladimir Putin, is unable to stem the flow. In fact, he's actively making matters worse, dragging his country deeper into the abyss, plunging himself and his people into a crisis from which they may never escape. Such as Putin's desperate obsession with the war, an egotistical need to be seen as a winner, no matter the cost. And the cost of this war is spiraling swiftly out of control. Russia's estimated defense spending for 2021, the year before the war began, was approximately $65 billion. In 2022, the year of the invasion, it surged to over $102 billion. By 2023, it was closing in on $110 billion, and in 2024, it was almost $150 billion. That alone was an extraordinary figure, but Putin was still eager to push it higher. So in 2025, Russia spent almost $200 billion on its military. At that point, the economic alarm bells weren't merely ringing, they were blaring out across the streets of Moscow for all to hear. The country was spending an increasing portion of its entire budget on defense, starving other industries of support. To compound this issue, Ukraine had begun an intense deep strike campaign against Russian infrastructure, targeting the very nodes that contributed the most to the country's economy, like oil refineries. Economic growth was plummeting, the budget was under pressure, and the central bank was struggling to contain inflation. At this point, even the Kremlin officials, who would usually toe the line and tell the public that everything was fine, were compelled to admit that the country was on a one-way track to financial disaster unless something changed. As a result, in June 2025, Putin promised that defense spending would be cut for 2026. At the same time, as NATO nations announced an increase in collective spending to 5% of their gross domestic product, GDP, Putin called a press conference and told the world, "But now here is the most important thing. We are planning to reduce defense spending. For us, next year and the year after, over the next 3-year period, we are planning for this." He went on to note that the Russian defense, finance, and economy ministries were all thinking in this direction. And so, it was expected that 2026 would, at last, see a noticeable decrease in the amount of money that Russia funneled into its war effort. Some optimistic analysts even wondered if this might be the first step towards a gradual easing of hostilities, paving the path towards peace. Then the 2026 numbers emerged, and everything changed. Russia's military spending reached a staggering 5.9 trillion rubles, $80 billion in the first quarter of the year. That's a 30% increase over the same period of the previous year, as military expenditure for Q1 of 2025 was just 4.5 trillion rubles, or $61 billion. The total federal spending for Q1 of 2026 was 12.8 trillion rubles, almost $175 billion, meaning that a whopping 46% of the state's entire expenditure was spent on defense. The majority of that money falls into the category of classified spending, so we don't know exactly what it was spent on, as the Kremlin prefers to keep the details of its military expenditure under wraps. Regardless, that's a colossal amount of cash to put into defense over the span of just 3 months, and it completely defies Putin's original promise that defense spending would decrease in 2026. As German Institute for International and Security Affairs economist Janis Kluger notes, the enormous increase in military spending is particularly noteworthy because Russia had originally planned to rein in the cost of the war this year. According to the budget law, military expenditure was supposed to shrink to 6.2% of GDP in 2026, down from 7.8% of GDP in 2025. However, in Q1 alone, it already accounted for 2.5% of Russia's expected full-year GDP. In other words, if Russia continued to spend at this same rate for the rest of the year, it would easily surpass its stated 6.2% of GDP target and could even reach an astonishing 10% of the annual GDP. Kluger notes that this is unlikely to happen, as historical data demonstrates that spending tends to calm down during the second and third quarters of the year. Even so, he notes that this is still a remarkably high result, adding that if Q1 is any indication of how the rest of the year will play out, then military spending of 9 to 10% of GDP could be realistic in 2026. Digging deeper into the numbers, Kluger notes that almost every second ruble spent from the federal budget ended up with the military. Ukrainian news outlet Ukrainian National News also calculated that, according to the Kremlin's own data, the Russian military machine has consumed around 2.7 billion rubles, almost $37 million per hour, and around 65 billion rubles, $885 million per day between January and March of 2026. According to Russian Ministry of Finance data analyzed by Yanis Kluger and reported by UNN, the Kremlin spent a record 5.908 trillion rubles on its military between January and March of 2026. This breaks down to a staggering 65 billion rubles, $885 million per day, and about 2.7 billion rubles, or $37 million per hour. As the outlet notes, 65 billion rubles is actually the annual budget for certain Russian regions, like Novgorod, which is allocated 69 billion per year, or Oryol, which is around 61 billion rubles to spend annually. In other words, in a single random day in January, Russia's military chewed through the sort of cash that could keep an entire region, housing hundreds of thousands of people, up and running for an entire year. UNN also found that the monthly outlay during Q1 of 2026 was almost 2 trillion rubles, or $27 billion. The report noted that this massive quarterly total broke down to a monthly outlay of almost 2 trillion rubles, or $27 billion. That's more than the annual budget of Russia's higher education system, which is set around 1.7 trillion rubles. It's also far more than the annual budget of every single Russian region, except Moscow itself. This is no longer simply a case of Russia being foolish or naive with its defense spending. The country has achieved a whole new level of recklessness. It's burning through cash at record rates, literally throwing away massive amounts of money that could be put to real use domestically. Those trillions of rubles thrown at the Kremlin's military machine could, for instance, have helped to prop up some of the country's struggling sectors, repair core infrastructure, improve public services, or help the tens of millions of Russian people who are struggling to make ends meet due to rising cost of living and inescapable inflation. Instead, on Putin's command, that money continues to be spent entirely and exclusively on the war. And perhaps Putin might be able to justify all that if he were actually winning the war. If the Russian army was making sweeping gains, claiming control of key towns and territories, and pushing towards an inevitable victory, Putin and his Kremlin cohorts could quite easily claim that the spending makes sense. They could convince the public that it would all be worth it in the end, telling them that they just need to hold on a little longer to cope with substandard services and a lack of funding for a little while more, and then at last Russia's grand victory would come, and everything would get better. But that's not happening. In fact, all the data points to the exact opposite. 2026 has seen Russia fail to make significant progress anywhere along the front lines. Instead, its forces have stalled, making only the most marginal gains in some areas and actually being pushed back in others as Ukraine retakes lost land. The Russian army has also reached the point of suffering more casualties than it can cope with. Recruitment rates have plateaued, while the numbers of deaths and injuries have gradually risen, meaning that the country's military is actively getting weaker, not stronger. On top of this, the country's economic woes have worsened due to Ukraine's persistent drone and missile strikes, and even the temporary boost to oil revenue provided by the war in Iran won't do much in the long run to help Moscow escape the mess it's in. And so, Putin finds himself stuck in a deep dark hole entirely of his own making. There's no way to justify his reckless spending. No argument or propaganda will be sufficient to convince the public that continuing to throw trillions of rubles into this conflict makes any sense whatsoever. Yet still, the Russian president continues to dig himself even deeper into crisis. Still, he refuses to relent or restructure his country's financial plans in any sort of rational or reasonable way. Still, he believes that throwing more and more cash at the crisis will somehow fix it. But he's wrong, and by the time he realizes how wrong he actually is, it'll be far too late. But before we dig deeper into the Russian economic crisis, if this is the kind of insight you want more of, make sure you're subscribed to The Military Show. We break it down like this every week. Now, the reason behind Russia's reckless, record-breaking defense spending essentially boils down to one simple thing: Putin's hubris. After more than 2 decades in power, Putin's narcissism can no longer be contained. He sees himself as Russia's greatest ever leader and believes he'll go down in history as the 21st century equivalent of Peter the Great. He believes he'll leave a remarkable legacy that'll be talked about for generations to come, that the Russian children of tomorrow will study and celebrate his incredible leadership long after he's gone. It's one of the reasons why he invaded Ukraine in the first place. Not content with the extraordinary amount of power and influence he already had, he decided to take even more, stealing land and resources from a neighboring nation and expanding the borders of his empire. He thought it would be easy. He was sorely mistaken. Now, years into the fight, he knows that this war is what he'll be remembered for. Everything that came before no longer matters, because the war with Ukraine has become so big, so costly, and so all-consuming that this will define his legacy one way or another. That's why Putin's ego will never ever allow him to accept defeat. He won't do the sensible, logical thing. He won't acknowledge Russia's colossal losses, accept that this hasn't worked out the way he wanted and walk away. Even though this would be by far the best thing he could possibly do for his people. Even though it would save countless lives and finally allow Russia to start rebuilding itself and putting money where it's really needed, into education, healthcare and infrastructure, for example. Even though it would be the sign of a truly great leader to have the humility to own his mistake, Putin won't do it. Because that would ruin his legacy. It would shatter the image he spent decades building. It would cement him not as the great military strategist he wants to portray himself as, but as an abject failure, unable to defeat even a far smaller opponent despite having one of the world's strongest military forces. He can't allow that to happen, so he does the only thing he can. He allocates larger and larger chunks of his country's increasingly strained budget to the defense sector. While we don't know exactly how the trillions of rubles are being spent, much of the money is likely going towards keeping the country's many defense plants working around the clock, as they have been for years, piecing together more missiles, drones and other weapons of war to fire on Ukrainian towns, cities and frontline fortifications. Now, a large chunk of Russia's defense spending is also reportedly going towards recruitment. As previously stated, the country is now struggling to bring in sufficient quantities of new recruits to replenish its ranks, suffering a net loss to its total number of soldiers in 2026. As a result, Moscow is becoming increasingly desperate, offering larger financial incentives, orchestrating misleading military marketing campaigns, and piling pressure on regional governors to find new soldiers by any means necessary. Russia also has to pay out large amounts of money to the families of fallen soldiers. And with Ukrainian officials reporting that around 35,000 Russians are killed or wounded each month, the Kremlin's compensation bill is getting bigger and bigger. Some of the defense budget is also being funneled out of the country into locations like North Korea and Africa, as Moscow turns to other nations to help with its military campaign. None of it is producing the desired results where it actually matters, on the battlefields along the front lines. And so, the spending goes on, the investment continues, despite the complete absence of any value or return. It's worth noting, however, that there may be an alternative explanation to Russia's outrageous Q1 2026 spending reports. In a post on his Russianomics blog, Yanis Kluger explains that the Russian Finance Ministry may have shifted military spending from 2025 into this year to not exceed last year's deficit plans. In other words, the Kremlin's accountants may have simply decided to engage in a little economic trickery, moving some of the figures from the 2025 reports into 2026 in order to make 2025's overall expenditure seem a little less ludicrous. Kluger highlights several key reasons why this could be the case. First, he points out that between September and November of 2025, Russia's federal budget spending was way off track. He estimated that if spending continued at that same rate, the country's budget deficit would be almost a whole percentage point higher than planned, 3.5% of GDP, instead of the Kremlin's stated goal of 2.6%. In the end, however, the federal budget deficit for 2025 was indeed recorded at 2.6%. That didn't seem to tally with the figures from the latter months of the year, and when he took a closer look at the Kremlin's financial reports, Kluger found that December's expenditures were suspiciously low, far lower than the usual levels. Finally, the financial analyst noted that detailed spending data for Q4 of 2025 revealed that there was very little classified spending towards the latter part of the year. Again, this didn't align with the earlier parts of the year, leading Kluger to conclude that the Kremlin may have pushed its spending into the early parts of 2026 instead. As a result, because of what he labels accounting acrobats of the finance ministry, Kluger notes that the underlying pace of spending in 2026 is not quite as high as the Q1 data suggests. He also suggested another potential theory, that Russia may be front-loading its military spending in 2026, making lots of large payments early on in the year with the intention of spending significantly less in the latter quarters. We won't really know the exact truth for quite some time, until the year is over and the full financial data for 2026 is made available. Either way, even if the Kremlin has been playing tricks with its economic reports, the fact remains that trillions of rubles were spent in a relatively short span of time. And trillions more continue to be spent with every passing month. It's not just unsustainable, it's actively destroying the country. As more time goes by, Russia's economy and society continue to bleed out, and it's reaching a point where the wound is simply far too large to ever have any hope of healing. The Kremlin's financial officials are effectively saying as much in their latest statement. In early June, reports emerged of senior figures within the Russian government and central bank breaking ranks and brazenly telling Vladimir Putin that the war is quite literally becoming too expensive and that the national budget won't be able to cope with it much longer. They've openly stated that the national budget deficit is approaching unsafe levels, urging the government to make cuts or efficiency savings in military spending to alleviate some of that financial pressure. And the data proves them right. Leaked government documents have shown that military spending for 2026 is expected to be at least 2 trillion rubles, $28 billion higher than planned. Those documents also included clear warnings from the country's finance minister, Anton Siluanov, who argued that the government will have no other choice but to freeze spending in other areas to plug the gap. He even said that the country's shortfall could rise to an eye-watering 4 trillion rubles, $56 billion in the years to come, unless things change. Even the world's wealthiest and most economically stable countries would struggle to sustain this ludicrous level of expenditure as it eats into the national budget and adds to the deficit. And Russia is far from stable right now. Its economy is slowing. Its GDP growth slipped into negative territory in Q1 of 2026, and forecasts predict zero growth for the remainder of 2026, even taking into account the temporarily higher oil prices triggered by the Iran war. In other words, all the signs suggest that an already terrible situation is going to get significantly worse. But Putin continues to ignore the experts. As Siluanov warns that reserves are not endless, Putin and his defense officials push back, preferring to seek savings in other areas, cutting corners elsewhere, and making life even harder for the Russian public, rather than making even the most minor of cuts to the military budget. It's a foolish and myopic approach, and the longer it continues, the worse the crisis will become, with some central bank officials even expecting a recession by the end of the year. Now you can learn more about Russia's economic turmoil in this video, which looks at how even state officials have started to turn on Putin. Alternatively, check out this video for a look at how Russia's control of Crimea could be coming to an end as Ukraine makes major strides towards liberating the peninsula region that was forcefully taken from it in 2014. And for more breaking military news and insightful analysis of the latest issues, subscribe to The Military Show today.